Hi, I'm Todd Austin. I'm a professor at University of Michigan, and this is a presentation that I often give to new PhD students to help them figure out how to get started on research. It's called the Zen of Research. I've recorded this video in the past. You can find an older version of it on my YouTube. Please like and subscribe. I recently did an update to this presentation when I gave it for a recent mentoring workshop that I was involved in. So I thought I would re-record it, and I hope you find it useful. Let's get started. Before I talk about research specifically, I want to just share with you my research journey. How did I get involved in research? I didn't even know what research was when I was an undergrad, and I just sort of fell into it by accident. And I want to tell you about that path. So when I was in high school, I initially didn't even want to go to college. I came from a small town in central Wisconsin where not many people went to college. But I fell in love with motorcycles, and my high school had a closed campus. And in order to ride my motorcycle as much as possible, I had to get off of campus during the day. And so I found out if I took classes at the local community college, I could basically get around the closed campus restrictions and drive my motorcycle. So I took a couple STEM classes at the local community college, and I really liked it. I really enjoyed college coursework. So at that point, I decided I should probably go to college. I spent 2 years there, and then afterwards, I topped out. There were no other classes you could take, so I transferred to the main school in Wisconsin, the main state school, which was the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And there I studied electrical engineering. I really liked computers and I wanted to learn more about how they were built. So I decided to go into electrical engineering. And then after a few years, I completed my bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and then took a position with Xerox. Still not interested in a research career at all, just really interested in getting a job and building some cool stuff. At Xerox, I was on a large copier development, and I was part of PaperPath. PaperPath were embedded programmers who moved paper around the machine. And so we had to debug our systems on actual physical hardware. And at the time, there was just one prototype of the machine, the copier machine we were working on. So being one of the newer people on the team, I did all my debugging in the middle of the night. And so it was really frustrating. I got so frustrated with the debug process that I went off and built a simulator for the entire machine, both the physics of the machine as well as the electronic components on the machine. And it was so useful to other people on the team, and it was starting to squish down the schedule for the entire project because now people could do development and debug in parallel, that management said, hey, we got to continue developing the simulator. Let's stick Todd in the research labs, and he can work on the simulator there. When I got to the research labs, the Webster Research Center, I was really surprised because it did not appear to me these people were actually working. They were having fun. They were pursuing their own interests that were useful to the company, and they were building and sharing infrastructure with each other. It just looked like a lot of fun. And so I thought, okay, now I like this research thing. I want to get involved in this. But to do it, I needed to get a PhD. So I started higher education while I was at Xerox. I went to the Rochester Institute of Technology, which was in the same city as Xerox in upstate New York, Rochester. And I studied computer engineering there, and I really got interested in computer architecture. How do you build computers? And that's what I'm still doing today. When I finished that, I then left Xerox and I went back to the University of Wisconsin to pursue my PhD in computer science. Why computer science? Because computer architecture at University of Wisconsin was centered in computer science. From school to school, it kind of depends on where computer architecture is. Usually CS or ECE or maybe a little bit of both. When I finished my PhD at University of Wisconsin after about 5.5 years, I didn't want to go into a research position at that time because I really wanted to go off and build some computers, right? I had met a lot of professors in academia who were very, very skilled at computer architecture, but really had never worked at building computers. And I wanted to have that experience. So I went to work for Intel for a number of years. And I really love working for Intel. Fantastic company. Really, you can really grow inside that company and really take on some really amazing tasks. I worked in the advanced technology group at Intel, and it was my job to really streamline load store processing for their future generation microarchitectures. And I did that. I also continued to do research and teaching at the Oregon Graduate Institute while I was at Intel because I wanted to stay viable because I had aspirations at some time in the future to go into academia. And I did that. After a few years, I went to University of Michigan, where I've been ever since, where I'm a professor in the computer science and engineering department. And what I do is I mentor students, I teach classes, I do research, but mostly I write proposals. No, just kidding. All right. So what is research? Let's take a look at what is research and how do you get started in it? That's a big challenge for new researchers. And the question, what is research? That's actually a pretty difficult question. And if you ask 10 people what is research, often you'll get 10 different answers. Sometimes it's easier to answer what is not research, where somebody will look at maybe some effort you've done or other people have done and say, oh, that is just not research. And they can give you a reason why it's not research. It's a little harder to give an answer that something is research. So I have a very specific definition that I use. I like it because it's very functional. And what it is you're doing research when you can teach your advisor something that's new, important, and insightful. And so let's just take a look at all those words, right? Advisor. What is an advisor? An advisor is your research mentor. In academia, you're going to have a specific person that you're working with that'll be assigned to you through whatever mating process the institution uses. Sometimes you're picked out of the application pool. Sometimes there's a few years when you can develop that relationship with your advisor. And it really is a relationship. It's a social relationship. It's a relationship that often and hopefully lasts long past when your graduate studies are over. That person is your mentor. That person is to help you pursue research in the most effective way possible. And that research that you pursue, it has to be something new. It has to provide some new knowledge that doesn't currently exist. So the goal is to really expand the knowledge in the field as you're doing that research. And it needs to be important. Now, who does it need to be important to? Well, it needs to be important to you and your advisor. Outside of that, the more people that it's important to, the better and the more potential impact the research can do. But as long as it's important to you and your advisor, that's important enough at the PhD stage. And then the work that you're doing has to be insightful. And what I mean by that is you're not just generating numbers and statistics. You're generating knowledge. And so you're using the generation of numbers and statistics to give you information about these systems. In computer architecture, we deal with these big complex systems. So we're trying to understand the relationship between many different things in the system. So we do measurement, we do experiments, but ultimately you want to come down to insights. And what insights are just English sentences that impart knowledge about the system. So that is the most important end result of your work. And when we talk a little bit later about writing papers, is what we want to write about is not the results that you're generating, but the insights that you're gaining from those results. And then, so let's just take a brief moment to look at what is this academic apparatus that if you go to get a PhD, for instance, in academia, that you'll be a part of. Well, it definitely starts with you, the student researcher. And you are vitally important. I tell my students that I don't do research. I watch people do research. I watch students do research. I'm really busy and I can mostly mentor research, but I don't get down into the details and start writing code. Well, I do write a little bit of code, but I have to do it in a way that doesn't impact my students adversely. But the student researchers are vitally important to the research process. They do the research. And then the mentor, me with my students, for example, my job is to is to help point you in the right direction, to give you positive, constructive feedback, to get excited about the results that we find, to figure out where, the direction we're going is not useful. Can we go in a better direction? That's really my role in the research process. And then often we'll collaborate. We'll collaborate with other research mentors. And so sometimes you'll be in a situation where you'll have multiple research mentors telling you things, hopefully not conflicting, but you'll have a sense that, there's multiple people interested. And then they'll bring their students onto the project as well. What's nice about a collaborative research effort is, they say that, a good collaboration, 1 + 1 = 3. That's really the case. When you bring together sort of these diverse talents and then attack a problem, often you'll be the first researchers that are able to attack that particular problem because you've assembled this team. And so collaborative research often is some of the most exciting and best research. But, as that collaboration grows, there can be more and more people involved. Sometimes there'll be people involved in the research and you won't even know what they're doing. Maybe they don't even contribute in a way that you see material. Maybe they're providing resources, maybe they're mentoring the research mentors, so just, you got to have an open mind to this process and, ask your research mentors about, what everybody's role is to help learn that. Now, research costs money, right? If you're receiving a stipend and tuition, and your mentors or part of their time is being paid to work on this research, that requires resources. And so the research is paid for by sponsors. And sponsors are organizations and companies that want to create new research to solve problems that they see are important, either for the country, society, for defense of the nation, for human health, etc. So, for examples of my sponsors are, DARPA, which is the Department of Defense research agency in the United States, National Science Foundation, which is just pure science funding in the United States. If your research is applicable to human health, life sciences, medicine, in the U.S. you can work with the National Institute of Health, NIH. Of course, companies are interested in research too. Companies that are great about sponsoring research are Intel and Google. They sponsor a lot of research. And then often you can get involved with organizations like SRC, the Semiconductor Research Corporation, which are consortiums of companies that are all working together to sponsor specific research. These are all great sponsors to work with. And then you're also interested in your research in influencing your stakeholders. So what are your stakeholders? Your stakeholders are organizations that are going to take the knowledge and the insights that you're generating and are going to put it to good use to basically solve the problems that you're trying to solve in your research. Now, that's not National Science Foundation. National Science Foundation just gets tax money and then sends it out to do research. So sometimes your sponsors are not your stakeholders. Now, of course, they want you to do a good job and publish, and so in a sense, they want you to be productive, but they aren't going to take that knowledge and implement. Your stakeholders tend to be companies, either companies you think of when, in my field of computer architecture, companies that make CPUs or design data centers like Google and Intel or NVIDIA, GPUs. But they can also be companies that are sort of higher up the food chain and use this technology, like here in Michigan. A number of my colleagues work with Rivian, which is the electric auto company here locally near the University of Michigan. Or you may go down the chain and work, with, like semiconductor manufacturers like KLA, which is another company here in Ann Arbor. Or you may just want to be influencing policymakers like the White House, like, think tanks, so that they can write recommendations that ultimately influence the sponsors. So you're creating research to, in a sense, create more funding for that research area with the eventual hope that it'll influence industry. And the way we communicate what we're doing to our stakeholders is primarily through 3 different mechanisms. We write papers and we communicate those papers to our stakeholders. We give talks that we can put up on YouTube. We can go visit the institutions. We can go to conferences. We give talks to those stakeholders, and that helps transmit information. And then we can share with them what we call artifacts, which are things that we've built in our research that can help them adopt those technologies more readily. And that would be an example of that would be like data sets we've created for AI training, or repos of code and example tools, etc. And then that's how we interface to our research, our stakeholder colleagues. So given that, I want to just spend a little bit of time and tell you about my research path, starting at the beginning of my PhD. Like, how did I get to where I am in terms of my research today? Just to kind of give you some color of how that research apparatus evolves and how it takes you to so many new and interesting places. So, if you go all the way back to the start of my PhD, I actually didn't start in computer architecture, which is the area I work in today. I started in the area of program debugging. And it's really interesting that, I started working on this project. I was one of the early inventors of this thing called the fat pointer, which is where you could take languages like C and you could wrap pointers with information, metadata that described what they want to point to, so that you could stop memory access errors. So if you go off the end of an array, and it was a really useful set of technologies that helped debug C code at the time, which is quite a while ago. But I was working with a professor at the time who eventually left the university to go take a position in industry. And so at the time, I couldn't really pursue that line of research anymore because the professor had left academia. So at that time, it was really necessary for me to figure out what it was I was going to do next. So at the time, I actually got recruited by a little company called Pure Software to go and work for them instead. And I was really sort of, at that point, I was saying, do I want to continue on my PhD, or do I want to go work for this company, Pure Software? And I decided, I think I'll go work and continue my PhD, which I think was a good choice. But I will there's a backstory here I got to tell you about. Pure Software was started by a guy named Reed Hastings, and he had a really fantastic team. And I when I went to the interview, I had breakfast with Reed Hastings. He said, "Todd, you got to come work for me. This company's doing great stuff." And eventually I said, no, I'm going to continue my PhD. But oh my gosh, Reed Hastings sold that little tiny software company, and then he went and founded with much of the same team another company which you might have heard of called Netflix. So that was that was the fork in the road where I probably could have went off and been very wealthy. I went off the other direction, and I got to do a lot of research. So anyway, I'm happy. I don't care. One of the intrinsic talents I've developed throughout my life is I have the inability to have regret. So I'm okay. So anyway, I went on and decided to do computer architecture, and I worked with another professor at that point, and I really liked that. I love learning how to build computers, and at the time, I was really frustrated by the tools that people were using. If you work in computer architecture, today we use these very sophisticated tools that simulate all aspects of the design. At the time, people were using traces that were being generated by companies of programs that you didn't even know anything about these programs. It was a really restrictive environment. So I started to build these tools that could actually simulate the programs that they're simulating. And it led to this simple scale tool set, which got me really interested in building infrastructure, and this was a really successful piece of work that I had early on. I was really quite fortunate to be involved with this work. And then from that, I then did my research using these tools. About 5.5 years later, I graduated. My thesis title was Hardware and Software Mechanisms for Reducing Load Latency. And at the time, you had to buy these 8-inch bound copies of your thesis and give them to all of your committee members for your defense. And I wanted a copy for myself, but I was too cheap to buy the 8-inch version. And so instead I just bought the 6-inch version, And then on the spine, all there was to that they could write was hardware and software. And I thought, that is the best thesis ever, right? As a computer architect, it's my job to understand hardware and software. So when students say, can I work with you to do software stuff? Can I work with you to do hardware stuff? I always point to my thesis up here on the wall and I say, look at my thesis. It says hardware and software. Of course I can support you in whatever way you want. And as I said earlier, I went to Intel, and at Intel I did microarchitecture. I just, I spent time trying to figure out how to build systems that could fetch instructions better, could schedule load stores more efficiently, kind of the work person's effort inside of computer microarchitecture. And I also worked with a lot of academic people as well through my Intel job. As I got towards the end of my Intel stint and then was going to start heading to University of Michigan to become a faculty member, I wanted to pick a piece of research initially that was really informed by my experience at Intel. And when I was at Intel, the one thing that really impressed me the most was how many people were working on verification, which was basically most of them. And so when I came back to University of Michigan, I decided I want to build a CPU that can tolerate its own bugs. And so that led to this project Diva, which was a really cool project. And I give other talks on that. You can look at my YouTube for other talks on that. It's a really fun project because it was really kind of came out of left field. Nobody had ever seen such a thing before. And at the same time, I also continued working on building infrastructure. I love building infrastructure because whoever has the best infrastructure gets to do the coolest research, at least in my area, computer architecture. So, for example, I worked with a number of students to build My Bench, which is still today even a really popular embedded benchmark suite. When I worked on that earlier Diva research, one of the frustrations I had was that I go off and solve this amazingly hard problem that all these companies have, where they have to spend, 6/7 of their development money on verification. Now you don't have to verify everything, and of course, nobody wants to adopt this technology. One of the things you learn as an academic that getting your technology into industry takes decades. It just does. So, with my early frustration of industry not taking my ideas, I decided I wanted to do just baby steps Diva. So I worked on an effort to basically build a computer that, instead of fixing all of its design errors, would just tolerate the fact that it didn't have enough voltage. And so some of the circuits were starting to fail. And that was a project called Razor. And that was a really fun project because we learned a lot about how much energy goes into making these circuits really reliable. And it got me really interested in low power design. But at the same time, I started to remember back to that early work I had on program debugging, and I wanted to start rematerializing that work. And that's one of the really great things about a research environment is you can bring all your skills to bear. You can develop multiple sets of skills at the same time. And as long as you can get students interested in it, get some support for the work, you can continue on it. And so I started to rematerialize my work in program debugging, but this time orienting it a little bit more towards security-related faults. And so started a line of work on that. And that was really interesting. But at the same time, still also focusing on these low-power microarchitectures. And in this project, I worked with a former student she's now a professor at Virginia Tech, and we wanted to design a processor that was so low power that transistors in the design didn't even turn on. In fact, all we did was modulate leakage, and we built a super low power processor, one of the lowest power processors ever. And then that work on low power design kind of morphed eventually into reliable system design, where we built CPUs that could tolerate their own defects, which was a lot of fun. And then started, collaborating with other researchers to come up with new and sort of interesting areas of research that that didn't even exist before. I had a really cool collaboration with some colleagues from the University of Washington, where we essentially wanted to come up with an idea where you could design your own chips in your house. And so, of course, you're not going to bring all that semiconductor manufacturing capability into your house. So we thought, how would you do that? Well, you're going to have to divide these chips up into little components, and then you're going to basically rematerialize your own custom chip by taking these little bricks of silicon and then connecting them together on this, another piece of silicon. And so this work, which is quite old, was really sort of the seminal work in chiplet-based design, which just now is finally becoming really exciting, hot research. And then I took another really great thing about academia is every seventh year you get it off to basically go and rediscover yourself and reinvent yourself. It's called sabbatical. And I took a sabbatical between these two pieces of work. And in that sabbatical, I went and taught courses in Ethiopia. Now, how did that come to pass? That's another story. But I do a lot of work in computer science development in Africa. And a lot of that started in my sabbatical in Ethiopia. Now, when you go teach in Ethiopia, it's a little bit different than the schools here in the U.S. In the schools here in the U.S., there's kind of like a palette of classes that you could take, and students pick which classes they want. But undergraduate work in Ethiopia, it's a set menu. You basically are all following the same classes every semester. And so when I got there, they said, hey, guess what? You're teaching a security class. And I've been dabbling in security, but I had not gotten to the point where I was teaching a class. So I was like, oh my gosh. So I said, okay, I'll do it. I'm here. I'm ready to teach this class. And I learned so much in that class. I learned, all kinds of, security stuff. I learned about hacking. I built projects for the students to hack. It was a lot of fun. It was scary too, because as I told the students, I was 1 hour ahead of them in terms of my knowledge, but the class was an hour and a half. So that last half an hour of the class was a little bit dodgy, but we got through it together. The other thing I learned is I really love security. I absolutely love the area of security. The way I describe my love for security is like all the other areas of computer engineering and computer science, they're always up against physics and complexity, things that were sort of born when the universe was born. But in the area of security, you're up against the evil masterminds of the world that are trying to penetrate all your systems. And that is such an exciting and competitive landscape. And so it's really, really exciting to work in that area. So I just, as an academic, I just said, yeah, I'm going there. I'm going to start working in the area. I started working with students, first doing a bunch of attacks. We had a really fun project where we built a 3-transistor backdoor for Linux and put it into a hardware design. That's called a Trojan, hardware Trojan. A lot of fun with that project. That project got a lot of press as well. And after a few years of working on attacks, I wanted to start working on defenses. And when you're a computer hardware security architect and you start to work on defenses, invariably your initial sense of defenses are so complicated that you can't even express them efficiently or probably can't implement them very well. And my first approach that I wanted to take was a project called Morpheus. And Morpheus was a real wacky project. It was a project that was inspired by the human T cell. Why the human T cell? Well, the human T cell is your defense system, and it's also good at stopping emergent attacks, things like COVID, which it's never seen before. It can detect and stop. So it's a really inspiring area. But our design was so complicated. And then as we were building it, we were just way behind schedule, and we were afraid we were going to lose our funding. And so at some point, just out of desperation, I told the team, hey, all this complexity we wanted to do, we're going to get rid of it. We're going to just do something that's not very efficient. We're going to encrypt everything everywhere. And oh my gosh, we'll deal with the performance implications later. And what was so interesting about that is that was an invention. That was an invention that was forced by a scheduling issue and trying not to get booted out of a funding program. And we made a discovery that when we encrypted everything everywhere, we got a performance hit, but we got a level of security that no one had ever seen before. In fact, at the end of this program, they had the DoD had hired hundreds of researchers to attack our machines, and our machine was never penetrated. It was the only machine that was never penetrated. So one of the cool things about research is sometimes you just kind of fall into an idea, and that idea can totally change your life. And it really has changed my life. I mean, I'm building machines that are provably not vulnerable to software hacking because they separate the data that you're concerned about from any software access. And so you got to break through crypto to get access to this data. And what's really exciting about that is that now you can start working in the area of privacy, which privacy is about controlling who could see what data when, not just stopping hacking. And that's a really exciting area. And then this has gotten me involved in formal verification because what you want to do when you have a cryptographically secure system is you want to prove mathematically that that system is not vulnerable to a certain class of attacks. You could demonstrate it with hired hackers, but that doesn't really show you that it's not invulnerable. It just says that those hackers could not penetrate your system. When you prove mathematically that something's not invulnerable, then you reach a new level of security. So that, again, this change in direction is taking me to areas that I never really thought I would be involved in. And of course, I'm still building benchmarks now in the area of privacy. So I'm always bringing my old skills with me to a new place. And most recently, I've taken this work out into a startup called Agita Labs, and where I built a team of formerly students here at University of Michigan, and we're building this technology we deploy into Azure and AWS, and that's really exciting. And now that publishing from there is through the U.S. Patent Office. So that's where I am today. So let's just take a look at what do you do when you want to get into research. You're a new researcher. This is a list of things that you should do, and as you do these things, you'll soon feel the momentum starting towards real research. Of course, remember, you want to do new research. We talked about that a few slides ago. And so how do you know you're doing new research? Of course, your advisor can help you know that you're going to do new research. But eventually, you have to get smarter than your advisor on your area of research. That sounds kind of wacky that you would be smarter than your advisor, but it always happens. My senior PhD students are all smarter on their topics and more informed on their topics than I am. And so the way you get there is you have to read a lot of research papers, and we talk later about how to read papers efficiently. Read. Spend time reading. I'm a senior person in the field. I read papers all the time. Spend lots of time reading papers. I want to know what's happening all the time. When you're trying to develop an idea, don't keep it just to yourself. If you're at a good school, you're surrounded by very talented students and talented professors. Share your idea with those students and professors to get feedback. Now, one of the corollaries to this action is you actually need to be in the department. You need to physically be located near where your other fellow students and professors are much of the time. We saw during COVID, all of us had to go to our little hidey holes for a couple of years. And so it was really hard to do this kind of, bouncing of ideas off of our colleagues. So now that we're out of that, we can do this again. And I highly recommend you spend time on campus. Don't just hide away in your department and do your work remotely. The way you get momentum in your research is you start to define a thesis topic that you want to pursue. And your advisor will help you with that. And eventually you will find this topic that you want to pursue. And then eventually you'll start to get results and insights on that topic. And then you'll start to see this explosion of directions that you can go into. And it's a really amazing transformation. Now, all of a sudden, you went from when you first came into the department not knowing what you were going to do to now you have more ideas that you can pursue with the time that you have available to you in a 24-hour day, 7 days a week. And so at that point, then you want to start mentoring junior students. A piece of advice I always give new PhD students is remember that your advisor, the professor you're working with, is a busy person. Probably one of the most busy persons that you've ever met in your life. Why? Because if you're at a good school working with a famous professor, that person is in demand by everybody on so many dimensions. Demand for teaching, for service, for professional service, for reviewing papers, for writing proposals, for working with other students, for working with you. And there's a lot of interruptions that can come with that kind of lifestyle. So just remember that, that person is very busy. And how does that manifest in your relationship? It manifests like, 2 out of 5 times I meet with my advisor reschedules the meeting, right? Don't get upset at your advisor. Just remember your advisor's a really busy person. If you take on that mindset, it'll help you adjust to the lifestyle that person has, and that lets you, be an important part of that person's life in a flexible way that gives you the most access that you need as a student. But just remember, that person's super busy, and they do care about you, even though they had to schedule that meeting twice before you could get together. And then show constructive initiative and push through challenges. I always like to talk about what's called the flywheel effect. I love this book called Good to Great, which is a book. It's got lots of advice on how do you go from being good at what you do to being great at what you do. And one of the things they recommend in the book is this thing called the flywheel effect, which is like you've got a really hard challenge. And going into research is a really, really hard challenge, especially when you're new. But even when you're not new, when you take on a new task, it's a hard challenge. And you can think of it as like this giant, heavy flywheel. And you go up and you give that flywheel a push, it doesn't move at all. Now, actually, it moved a few molecules or atoms, but it doesn't. You can't see it moving. So the idea is every day give it a little push. That's the constructive initiative. Do something that you know could potentially lead to progress. Reading more papers, building some infrastructure, trying some experiments. And what will happen is eventually you'll come back to the flywheel one day and you'll see that it's moving. It's moving. Barely can perceive it, but it is moving. And then if you keep pushing through, it'll start moving more. And as you get into your career, every once in a while, you'll know that when you're pushing on this flywheel, it's accelerating. And then one day you'll come the next day to push on the flywheel. And when you arrive, you'll see there's other people pushing on the flywheel. You've actually created a line of research that other people want to join. And now the flywheel it's on its own. And you can actually leave and go do something else. And when you look back, you see that flywheel is still spinning around. That is the beauty of research and the beauty of taking a hard problem and then overcoming that hard problem. And it's always hard at first. One of the most important things you can do during your PhD is learn how to write clearly and express ideas clearly in meetings. This is useful in every walk of your career, be it research in academia, research in industry, or just development in industry. You will learn how to be more effective at your job if you can clearly express yourself in presentations and in writing. So, what does that mean? That means you have to do those things. You have to put yourself out there to do presentations. If there's a reading group, volunteer for it regularly. If there is an opportunity to present a paper in the group meeting, present that work. Take the opportunity. Presentation is a skill you can develop, and presenting is a skill that you can develop. And we'll talk more about that later, but it's really nerve-wracking at first, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. So that's things you can do to move in the direction of research. Here's things I recommend you do not do And these are my opinions. People can disagree with them. I think these are things you should not do when you're pursuing your early research. Don't expect to change the world with your early work. I always ask students when I give this presentation, I go, what is your job as a PhD student? And people say, oh, to write papers, to invent stuff. Nah. Your number one job as a PhD student is to get a PhD. You don't have to change the world to get a PhD. You need to learn how to do research and provide a new result that is of a caliber that a PhD student from that institution would get. That does not require changing the world with your research. So why overlay that expectation onto your early work when it's not likely that you'll be able to do that initially, and it's not even expected that you will do that? The way I see this manifest in young researchers is I'll sometimes see a person who doesn't want to move forward on a research idea because it doesn't have enough impact. And that's a person who's wanting to have the ability to change the world in their early work. And it's just slowing you down. It's slowing you down. Now, expecting to change the world, that's a great career goal. But I would reserve your desire to do that for your career rather than for your PhD. Now, you may change the world in your PhD. It's happened before, but it's not happening with such rapidity that I would want you to really put that on your back initially. Things you should not do is avoid failure and rejection. Why? Because failure and rejection are tools in the field of research, unfortunately, but it is the truth. Failure is how we find good ideas. We go in direction A, it doesn't work. We learn the insights of why direction A didn't work, and we pivot into direction B, and then we see if direction B works. If it doesn't, we pivot into direction C. Boom, C works. Failure is how you find your good research. So you will start things that do not work out. That means you are pushing, through those barriers, around those barriers to good research. If you never have failure in your research, maybe you're not really doing research that's breaking, new ground. You're just maybe being a little bit too safe. So that failure not only is a way to get to good research, but it tells you that you're really trying to push the boundaries of what is possible. And unfortunately, rejection is how the field does refinement. When we send papers to conferences, if you want to publish in a good conference, that conference is going to reject most of the papers, including many of the good papers. And it is that rejection process that, tries to call out the most interesting work, and in the process, sends a lot of papers off to their rejection. So you are going to get rejected. I get rejected all the time. And I have a very successful publishing career. But I get rejected all the time. And it hurts. And it hurts me for my students. But you just got to pick yourself up. You got to take the signals in those reviews. And you got to refine that paper and do your best to get it published. One thing I definitely recommend you don't do is reinvent yourself with research that doesn't leverage your core strengths. Every single person watching this video has core strengths. If you got into a PhD program, it's because you have core strengths. There's things you know how to do. When we went through my research process, you saw I had that debugging line of work that just kept getting born again and again because it was a core strength that I had. And then I eventually brought it in and mixed it with my computer architecture work. Using your core strengths it basically gives you the most leverage over everything that's happened to you in your career. It gives you the most ability to do interesting and novel research. Where I see students sometimes not doing this is, to give you an example, let's say there's some student and the student did their undergrad work and their undergrad research experience in say power system design. And then they come into grad school, and then on day 2 of grad school, they say, hey, that power system design stuff was great, but I'm off to do machine learning accelerators. Okay, well, okay, you lost all that early investment that you did. I think a better approach is for that person to say, oh, I want to utilize AI in my work. So instead of just abandoning my old talents and going to this new area and starting at zero, why don't I take what I know about power systems and mix it with what I'm learning in AI and try to build AI designed power systems, or power systems that have AI capabilities for adjusting and optimizing, auto tuning. That's, I think, a much better approach. And the way I like to express that is that, you take your toys to someone else's sandbox. And then what happens is, as you go through your career, the tip of your spear is got everything you've done in your entire career behind you. So it's really a way to make the most out of your career. This one's a little controversial, but I will stand behind it. Try not to be perfect. It's very, very expensive. I think Voltaire said that perfection is the enemy of progress, and I truly believe this. In computer science terminology, I would say that good is linear, great is polynomial, and perfection is exponential. It just takes so much effort to get perfection. You never actually get there. And then where I see this manifest sometimes is when students are working on writing, where like you're writing a result up, and you have to share that document with your co-authors, your mentors. Perhaps you're on a schedule to a submission to a conference at a certain date, and you just don't want to give that text up. It's not good enough. It's not good enough. It's not good enough. I'm going to keep working on it. I'm going to keep working on it. And, make it good, share it, work to make it great, share it. Don't worry about perfection. All my papers have issues in them all the way back, but they have value too, because they got published and they had good ideas in them. So don't try to be perfect. It will simply paralyze it and slow you down. And then another thing is not to be too overly afraid. It's always fearful. It's always a fear-ridden experience to go into research. Even new research as an experienced researcher, because you don't know what's gonna happen. I tell my students that, like, designing hardware and actually building it, it's like watching a horror movie, because something bad's gonna happen. It's gonna be super hard to fix. And so, but over time you realize, oh, we're gonna be able to fix that, and you're gonna learn how to build infrastructure to help you be the most successful at fixing those problems. But initially, it's very scary to do research because there's so much uncertainty involved in it. And you can actually become paralyzed. You can get to the point where you don't want to move forward because it's too fearful. An example where I can see this with students is they'll be working on experiments, and they'll generate tons of information and statistics. But when I meet with them, they haven't actually looked at them to try and figure out what are the insights. And I think that's probably partly due to fear, because you're afraid that you're going to see something that doesn't work and that what you've been trying to do isn't working. But remember, if you understand those results, it'll inform you on where to go next. So try not to be too afraid. And then I also want to mention imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is this feeling that often early researchers get, like they get in the back of their mind, like, I'm just not cut out to do research. And that I'm an imposter in this environment. Like somehow I got misplaced into this environment. Let me tell you, this feeling is almost universal. Many students get this feeling early in their research career. And it's so amazing. One of the greatest parts of my job is going from like trying to ease the fears of imposter syndrome, and then 2 to 3 to 4 years later, seeing this student walk the halls with just good research ideas dropping out of their pockets, they become essentially these research machines that are at the top of their field within just a period of 3 to 4 years. So push through that imposter syndrome. Sometimes they talk about faking it till you make it, which in a sense is kind of like that flywheel effect. Like I don't know exactly what to do here, but I'm going to fake it until I make it. A couple pieces of advice I'll give you. So with imposter syndrome, I think the best thing that you can do to allay that is to talk to senior PhD students in your area and ask them, like, did you ever have this feeling, and what did you do about it? And if they say no, then just go to the next one. You're going to find somebody really fast that had that feeling, and they're going to tell you, that it subsides. So push through. And then I always like to remind advisors that we have responsibilities as well of what we should be providing to our students. We are not just these, ivory tower figures where, people do what we want. We have a responsibility to you as our student researchers as well. So we have to help you find fruitful research topics. We should have lots of different areas that you can work with. And often you can team up with a senior PhD student initially just to kind of learn, what is it that I should be doing here? When you're doing writing, when you're interpreting your results, when you are doing presentations, preparing for your qualifiers and prelims, we should be giving constructive criticism. What is that? That is feedback on how to improve those materials, and it's feedback that's positive, that shows a path to improvement. Now, sometimes you'll get feedback, and that feedback will make you feel bad. Okay, and then at that point, you have to ask yourself, is that because the person I'm working with is expressing criticism in a negative way? That can happen. They shouldn't. Or are they expressing criticism in a positive way and then I'm beating myself up? If that's the case, don't beat yourself up. Everybody needs criticism. I still take criticism, right? I want to know, how do I frame this work? How do I frame this work to make it the most effective at advancing the field? We need criticism, and that criticism should always be constructive criticism. Now, you will run into people that have just a very negative approach on how they express themselves. This can especially happen in reviews of papers where people are anonymous and they can basically take a shot at you with nobody knowing. Again, steel yourself, talk to your advisors, make sure the people around you are providing constructive criticism. One of the things your advisor has that you're only initially developing is sort of a nose for good research. Like, they can tell if an idea is likely going to be fruitful just by hearing about it. Just, 2 or 3 sentences, and all of a sudden, ting, spidey sense goes off, and like, oh, that's a good idea, or maybe try this as well. They have so much experience that they can help you assess how fruitful a line of research is potentially. And then, of course, as you go through the PhD process and you've got to do your qualifiers, your prelims, it really depends on the school where you're at as to which of these processes you have to go through. Your PhD advisor should be standing by you, preparing you throughout that process. Like I tell my PhD students, like, my goal when you go into the prelims here at University of Michigan, where they have to defend a piece of work they did to 3 professors, it does not include me. My goal is to make sure you don't get a question you haven't heard before, because I want you to be fully prepared. They're going to help find you work, either research assistantships, teaching assistantships, or fellowships. And they're going to help you get a good job after you graduate. And that's a great way to get a job after you graduate, because your advisor probably has a lot of great contacts in industry and academia, depending on whichever route you want to go. There's a few other aspects of research I want to talk about. Let's say you're a graduate student, you want to be in the research program, but you're not. You're just a master's student. How do you graduate up to being a student researcher? Well, I think the goal there is just do good work and be visible. Sometimes students think they can send emails to everybody and something's going to fall in their lap. That's pretty rare. That's pretty rare. I would say the better way to get into research, if you're not in research already, is to do good work in your classes and to befriend faculty who are in the area of your interest and really be visible. Put yourself out there so they can see the work that you're doing, which a great way to do that is by taking their classes. A few anxieties that advisors like myself have is underperforming students. These are students that are not making good progress. And then that's where you really have to debug it. Is it imposter syndrome? Is it paralysis because they don't know what to do? Do they need more mentoring? When you're not making progress, that system has to be debugged. So, don't just be depressed. Try to talk to your mentors. Say, I wish I was going faster. Maybe the feedback is you're doing great. And maybe you're just setting too high expectations for yourself. I've had students where they say, I need to be making better progress. And I say, well, I consider you doing fantastic. So express yourself. And then achieving graduate students that were not unable to support. Sometimes we're not able to find support for students. Fortunately, most programs can use teaching as a way to continue to support that student. And then depending on the advisor, students that need a lot of micromanaging, that may not be a good fit for some advisors. So if that fit is wrong, then maybe you need a different advisor. Sometimes advisors like to micromanage their students. Some advisors even work on the projects directly with their students. I'm a different kind of advisor. I don't get into my students' actual research. I mean, I follow it and I learn about it and all this stuff, but I don't work on their projects just because my time is so non-deterministic. I wouldn't want to slow their projects down. So I tend to be the advisor that say, we're going that way. Show me how to get there. So it really depends on the advisor. I always like to remind PhD students, especially, that your goal is to get a PhD. Your goal is not to write a thesis. The end result of your PhD is not a thesis. It is you, a researcher. So part of that is your thesis. But there's many other things, many other skills you're going to acquire along the way that may be even more valuable to you going down the line. So be open to all the different things that can be done in terms of your PhD experience. And remember that when you're a research assistant or a teaching assistant, you are assisting. So there's many things you need to do. I'll often see students that when something needs to be done, like building a tool or managing some infrastructure, I see the gears turning where the students are thinking, how is this going to help my PhD thesis? And that's not the way you should be looking at it. You should be looking at it like, is this a good skill that I should acquire as I transition to become a researcher? Right? Remember that PhD thesis is just one part of getting the PhD. So things you need to do. You need to build infrastructure. And really, as I said earlier, those who have the best infrastructure get to do the coolest experiments. And you need to manage infrastructure as well, like simulation pools. Certainly in my area, computer architecture, you need lots of computers. You need to mentor undergraduates and early PhD students. As you get more and more into your program, you have lots of ideas. Grab some of those undergraduates and mentor them. They need those experiences to get into grad school, and you can help provide that bandwidth. Often you'll be asked to review papers with your advisor. That's a super important part of the PhD process, and always be constructive, of course, with your criticism. Your advisor is often writing proposals and needs help with your proposals. And one thing I like to remind senior PhD students is often a senior PhD student will be on a project, and their funding is pretty much guaranteed because the project they're on is funded. And then you'll see these PhD fellowships come down from companies like IBM and NSF and stuff, and the senior students say, I'm set, I don't need a fellowship. And by the way, to get a fellowship, you're going to have to write a research statement. You're going to have to maybe take an interview. It's a bit of a hassle. So I always remind senior PhD students, like, do it, because A, it's an accolade to get those fellowships, and B, when your money goes, when your money comes from that fellowship, the money that was paying you goes to another student. So basically, you created an opportunity for another student by getting that fellowship and teaching. Don't be, I highly recommend you don't avoid teaching at all costs. Some schools will allow you to do that. Some schools will force you to teach at least one semester. But I think as a researcher, you need to understand, is part of your calling also teaching? And one of the ways to discover that is to teach a class. I've had students before, they go off and teach a class, a little bit dreading it. It's really going to kill my research productivity. And then they come out of the experience going, wow, did I love teaching that class? Teaching is a great, I'll say, when we interact with our industry colleagues, often they'll say, those who can't do, those who can't teach. I don't like that statement at all. Teaching is a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to impart knowledge to students and to give them the knowledge they need to make their careers go forward. You are literally changing lives as you are teaching. Also, when you teach material, you will understand it at a depth that you didn't think was possible. So the benefit to you is immense. Like that class I talked about earlier, when I had to go teach that security class, right? There are so many of my colleagues in hardware architecture doing security. They've never taught a security class. They don't understand the nuts and bolts of doing attacks, because I had to build the units and the experiments. I really had to force myself to get down and dirty into the details. And when you do that, you gain a level of knowledge that really helps you pursue more fundamental, more impactful research. And then a few other considerations. These are mostly things that people have asked me after I've given this talk. And I said, oh, that's such a good question. I'm going to add this to this. One thing you may experience, hopefully not, but you may experience, is a research conflict. This is where there's a team working on a problem, and then there's a disagreement among the team, and the disagreement is causing stress. Now, as a student researcher, 9 times out of 10, if you do get involved in a research conflict, it's probably going to be who is first author on this paper. In many of the STEM areas, computer architecture included, the order of the authors defines their involvement, and that the first author position is the most regarded. Typically the student that had the most input on the project. But often on collaborative projects, there's multiple students that had large input on the project. And so then you get to this situation. What do you do in that situation? I advise you to talk to your advisors about it. Be open about the fact that this conflict is developing, and let them help you resolve that conflict. And, it's hard to resolve the conflict. Maybe you could do like a, star the first 2 names, equal involvement. That I've seen before. I like that. Or maybe you could do something like, we'll do 2 papers. You'll be first author on this one. I'll be a first author on the next one. Definite challenge that you may encounter. As you go through your career, people may say, hey, why don't you come be a co-author on my paper so that I can be a co-author on your paper? Now, maybe the involvement is low on those collaborating efforts. Early in my career, someone approached me and asked me that same thing. And I thought, oh, my, do I want to be on this? I didn't really work on this paper. I don't really think. And, if you've ever watched The Godfather or any of those kind of movies, you know that if you jump onto that person's paper, the request is coming back to you to jump onto your paper. So I thought to myself, I think I'm going to just politely say no and avoid it. Now, why do people do stuff like this? They do stuff like this because they want to increase the amount of research they're producing by being on a bunch of papers, maybe papers that they have minimal involvement in. But I would advise you to not jump on other people's papers. Let me give you a couple of reasons. One, today's world, we have Google Scholar, so that the impact is no longer the number of papers you have, which when early in my career, that was the number everybody was trying to maximize. The impact is how many people are citing your papers. What is your H index? What's sort of the bulk of your work? And so that can be assessed without having to be on tons and tons of papers. And then the other reason I would recommend that you don't jump on other people's papers is because when you jump on other people's papers, you muddy the waters about what you are as a researcher. If you're on all kinds of different papers that aren't really related to your research, people aren't going to know what kind of researcher you are. What are the ideas that you have created in this world? Like for me, the ideas I create are tolerating faults, tolerating errors, tolerating design bugs, using uncertainty to build secure systems, leaning into crypto. Those are like themes that run through all my papers. And the reason why those themes run through my papers is because I worked on all those papers. And the reason why people see me as the person that pushes those ideas is because I'm not on a lot of papers that have nothing to do with that stuff. So, stick to your what you want to work on and really define yourself by your papers. Another really interesting thing to consider is what kind of research should you work on? Should you work on what's super hot in the area, or should you try to find something that's super cold in the area? By hot and cold, I mean hot. Hot means research that's super exciting and everybody wants to learn more about, and typically everybody wants to jump onto this train. It's really exciting. So I'm in computer architecture. So the white hot area of computer architecture is AI accelerators. Very important, very competitive, very hot. Okay. And then cold. What's cold? Cold in computer architecture. Well, today cold might be, let's say, reconfigurable computing, for instance. Pretty cold. Now, what are the trade-offs there? If you're on something that's super hot, you are in a race. There's a bunch of smart people out there, loads of them working on your area. Now you're on a race to get the next great idea. And you may be beaten by others because, everybody else is probably going to see the opportunities that you see. And so you're in a race. You've got to move fast. And publishing is going to be a little more challenging because you're going to see in the hottest areas, you're going to get the most papers, but conferences don't want to just publish one area. They're going to only have a couple of sessions on AI accelerators at the architecture conferences. So the rejection rate in those areas is going to be higher. Now, on the plus side, if you graduate, you're an AI accelerator person, oh man, the jobs you're going to get are amazing, right? Because it's such an important and interesting area. Now, if you're on too cold of an area, people are going to look at your work and go, this doesn't look very useful, right? So then now you're sort of burdened with really making a case on why this work is important, right? You don't really have to have too many paragraphs at the beginning of your AI accelerator paper saying AI acceleration could be very important. We all know that. But maybe you have a new spin on reconfigurable computing, and you're going to have to make that case in a more solid way. So, personally, I like to kind of be in the middle. I like to work on the second most important thing in the area. Right now, I've spent a lot of time on security. I think that's a good second most. And I'm slowly transitioning into privacy, which I think isn't even really thought about in the computer architecture world. And I'm trying to develop that area. So for me, I like being a little bit off the critical path of the field. And I think it's good for the field to get down into those other areas as well. We can't all work on the same thing. And then one of the most exciting things for me in my career is as you go through your career, you get to really understand how you approach research, and you get to look at your research and say, like, oh, this work was really successful. Why was it successful? This work was really not successful. Why was it not successful? And you can start to learn what are the levers that you can manipulate to try to approach research in a way so you can improve your chance of impact and success. And so in that regard, my approach, and I give a talk on this, and you can find this on my YouTube page as well, is my approach to research is called rule breaking approach to research, where you have to find a rule that nobody breaks, and you got to break that rule. Now, why do you do that? Because the rule is like a barrier. It's dogma that prevents people from going and looking at what happens when you break that rule. So, for example, a rule you break in that first piece of work I talked about, release a CPU with bugs in it. Because why? Because you're going to tolerate those bugs. So it's fun to get into the point of your career where you can start to understand your research style. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about writing papers. As an early researcher, your goal is to get that first piece of research so you can write it up and then get it published in a good conference or a journal. Now, in computer architecture, our journals are kind of like where we send better developed conference papers. Where we send everything is to the top conferences, the ISCAs, the Micros, the HPCAs. Now, in your field, it may be journals is where you're going to send stuff to, but I think you can find value in this, regardless of where you are in STEM. So these are tips on how to write a paper that can improve your chances of getting it published earlier, and that is that it's easy for reviewers to review your paper. All right. So let's look at a couple tips at writing technical papers. Tip number 1: assume no one will ever read your paper. This is a very non-intuitive tip to an earlier researcher, but when you get into the field, you'll learn that getting through the review process is incredibly hard. And the more effectively you transmit the information from your paper, the more easily you can get through this review process. To understand this, let's take a quick look at how papers get reviewed and accepted into conferences. So there's a conference deadline. Everybody's working on their papers. They're submitting all their papers to the conference. Good conferences get a lot of papers and they reject a lot of papers. But they need to build this review committee, which is typically, overworked professors, and they're asked to review 20, 30 papers each. And they give them 2 months, and then they always plot the graph of how many papers were reviewed over time. And it's always like the last few days, all the papers get reviewed. Okay, so they're not taking months to review the papers, they're taking a couple days to review the papers. And depending on the area, it can be even more challenging. If your area is, AI, it can be much challenging. Neural IPS last year got 12,000 papers submissions. Incredibly large number of papers. So what you really need is you need someone on that review committee that's a champion for your paper, and they say like, oh, this is a good paper. This paper could be published. And sort of the key differentiator on how you acquire those champions is really how efficiently does the paper transmit its ideas to the reviewer. And so that's what we're going to look at now. We're going to look at how to really write a paper so it transmits its ideas very, very efficiently. Let's take a look at how do you transmit those key ideas efficiently? Well, very important. You need a tight story for your paper. I like to tell students that writing a paper should be more like storytelling, less like technical presentation. And you want to make your story compelling. You want an important reason why you're doing what you want. You want to make it almost surprising what your result is and what your approach is, and exciting the results that you got. So use storytelling as an approach for presenting your work, and then convey that work in a very efficient manner. You need a great abstract. Often when people write papers, the abstract gets written in the last 10 minutes before the paper is going to be submitted. That's exactly the wrong thing to do. That is the part of your paper everyone will read, for sure. So you need an on-point abstract with a summary of the results and the insights. Very, very important. I like to start by writing the abstract of the paper, just to sort of set the tone for the entire paper. What is this paper about? That's what this is about. It's almost like mission statement for the rest of the writing that's going to occur over the next month or two. And you need a clear and standalone introduction. That will likely also be read. You don't want to bury the results and the insights at the end of the paper. You want to bring them up and materially present them in the introduction. I should be able to read your introduction and know with good precision what your paper is, what problem it's trying to solve, what approach is it. I don't know all the details, but I have a sense of what the approach is and what's valuable and novel about the approach. And then what were the good results that you got out of that to show me. That and even why that is novel in the context of the work. If you can get all that in your introduction, that is really, really valuable, because now the reviewer only needs to read your introduction to understand the high level details. And then I also always tell students, lay out the details of the story in your figures and your captions. I'm a huge fan of the paragraph caption, because this is another part of your paper that people will often take a good look at. Oh, interesting. That's your design. And a description. I follow. I see what you're doing here. Oh, this is the measurement that really motivated that design. Oh, I understand that. These are your results. Fantastic. Oh, here's a table comparing you to other work, with, on these 5 dimensions. Wow, that's a really good, I don't need to read the paper anymore. I'm getting the information I need straight out of the figures and the tables. So, and then you also need a good conclusion that can really wrap up the results and show that there's weight to this material and that it has, that it can continue a line of research. Years after I started presenting this approach for writing papers, someone said, hey, you should check out this YouTube video by Andrew Ng, who's, one of the, early founders of deep neural nets, how scaling up to very large size neural nets is really important. And in one of his classes at Stanford, he would give this talk on how to read papers. And I invite you to go check out his lecture. It's a really good lecture. And he says, first read the abstract. If it looks interesting, then read the introduction. And if you got everything you need, you're done. Otherwise, read, the figures and the conclusion. And basically, he's describing exactly the way I want to write my paper. I want to make sure that you're satisfied at the earliest step of that reading. And I'll also add, sometimes you'll read papers and they won't make any sense at all. And so there's 2 reasons for that. One is that the material is above what you can comprehend. But also the paper may be poorly written. Some papers get published and they're poorly written. So just because you don't understand a paper, don't always think that it's your fault. Try to read the background material and then try to pull the information out of the paper. Eventually, you may get it, and you may realize that it's just not very well presented paper. Writing well-written technical papers is a very challenging task. Here's a few other paper tips that I always like to share with students. In computer science and computer architecture, across all the systems area, we have rebuttals. So you submit your paper by the deadline. The paper gets reviewed by members of the program committee. Then the reviews come back to the authors, and they're able to rebut the criticisms of the paper or provide additional information. Typically, they say you can't do new experiments or add any information to the paper, but you can clarify stuff. And just a few observations on this. I think, in my experience, having been on many program committees, the rebuttal is not really useful to the people that reviewed your paper. Only a fraction of the committee reviews your paper. It's most useful to those who have not reviewed your paper, have not even read your paper. And to understand why, you need to look at basically how papers get accepted. When the reviews are all done, they have numeric scores for the papers. You're going to sort the papers by the average numeric score given. And the ones that are way at the top, typically the program committee is going to go, oh, these papers are all well liked by most of the reviewers. I move to accept all these papers. So I second, vote, done, blah, blah. You don't even talk about And there's a bunch of papers which people generally didn't like. You know, they have problems or such that they didn't get a lot of positive reviews at all. And then I so move, we reject all these papers and so much and reject it. Okay, not even discuss. And then you get this batch in the middle. And often you'll end up in that batch in the middle. And those papers are going to be discussed, typically one by one, from the highest rated to the lowest rated. And they're on the cusp. And so you're trying to decide, does this paper get in or does it not get in? And so during those discussions, there's going to be reviewers who have a defined opinion. They've read the paper, right? And then there's going to be the rest of the committee listening to the discussion. And the discussion is going to come down to, you know, is this particular criticism warrant the paper getting rejected or not, typically? And so what the rebuttal can do is the rebuttal can inform the rest of the committee about your criticism that is being discussed. So a couple things that you have to do is you have to write the rebuttal for people that have not read the paper. And you need to successfully predict what are those criticisms that could come up. And if you can do both those things, there may be a chance that your rebuttal is going to get your paper accepted. And, you know, good luck. So when you see a rebuttal and, you know, they give you so many words to your rebuttal and you do a list, reviewer 2A, yes with and gates, that is pretty much not going to accomplish the task that I talked about, because that is a note to reviewer 2A answering a specific question they had. Reviewer 2A is probably already decided if your paper is getting in or getting rejected. You really need to be working on the rest of the committee. And so what you do with the rest of the committee is you basically have to look at your reviews and you have to come up with 3, no more. Maybe they give you 1,000 words. Don't use them all. Come up with 3 signals in the review. 3 criticisms, substantive criticisms. Restate those criticisms in a way that perhaps scoops up a lot of stuff in your reviews. And answer that criticism in a way that can get your paper accepted. Like, Q, do virtual memory aliases break your design? That may be a question that wasn't addressed in your paper. And people are saying, oh, this is a problem. I think virtual memory aliases break this paper. A, no, for the following reason. Now, if there's an argument about they didn't cover virtual memory aliases, someone else in the committee that didn't even read your paper can go, just look at the rebuttal here. It says that it doesn't cause a problem because of this. That's how you can use a rebuttal to help get your paper accepted, in my opinion. And then one last paper tip, I would just say, name your research. Name your research. Why? When you name your research, you make it easy for people to talk about your research. And we want people to talk about our research. We want people out there to be talking about our research and how good it is, or even how bad it is. And research is really no bad publicity. If they're talking about it, it's good. Okay, so name your research. And then for bonus points, give it an evocative name. Now, one time I got a project from a student in one of my classes that was a completely inappropriate name because they gave it a provocative name. And provocative and evocative, those are 2 different words. Provocative means to provoke and upset. Don't give it a provocative name. Give it an evocative name. What that means is it's a name that the word suggests a concept that is amenable to your project. To give you an example, years ago I had a project where we would lower the voltage on circuits until they would start to fail. We were shaving off voltage until the design was just starting to fail. And we called it Razor because Razor was shaving off voltage and saving energy. For more bonus points, use a name that Google has never seen. Like take 2 words and jam them together, for example. Then you can see what everybody's saying about your research. And that's really valuable as well. All right, so there's some tips on how to write a paper. Now I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about how to present your work. And I highly recommend this lecture from Professor David Patterson. If you're in the area of computer architecture, of course you know the name David Patterson. He wrote half of the Patterson and Hennessy book, you know, one of the inventors of RISC-V, etc. Super famous architect. And he gives a lecture. It's a great lecture. It's too much for this particular lecture, but he talks about how to give a bad talk. And so basically everything that he's suggesting that you do is things you should not do. So you should, thou shalt not be neat. You want to be neat. Don't waste space. Don't put too much on your slides. Cover brevity. Yes. To be brief. Animate everything. No, don't animate everything. Never write large. Never use so it's always the opposite, and so it's a little bit confusing. But also, there's 10 commandments. He's trying to follow this 10 commandments prototype. But really, in reality, I've been doing this presentation for a long time to my students, and there's really just 3 ideas that he's talking about here. So this is my distilled version of the very good talk, which I recommend you check out sometime. Professor Patterson's How to Give a Bad Talk. These are things you should do to give a good presentation. 1, limit the amount and rate of information delivery in your talk. You can think of a presentation as a channel into the brain of your attendees. And we have so much information in our slides, and then the attendees get a certain amount of information out of that information from your slides, okay? And so you start out, like if you do a very, very simple talk, you have very low information, you probably get good retention. And as you put more and more stuff in your slides, because you're not wasting space, because you're not being brief, because you're illustrating, you're just putting more and more details into your slides. Maybe you're even adding more detail than the paper you're presenting. And then the information density is going up. Maybe the retention is going up. Maybe it's not. I would argue that this curve looks like this. That as you add more information to your slides, that's on this axis, the amount of information your attendee acquires is more and more and more. And then when you hit this plateau, I don't know if you've ever experienced this. I've experienced this where you feel like you just fell off the talk. Like the train came off the tracks. I thought I knew what this person was saying, but now I don't even understand what this person is saying. I remember years ago I was in a presentation that was on formal verification, which is always very mathy and hard, but I love that area. And the presenter was really digging down into the details. And I mean, I was lost after about 5 slides. And I was sitting right behind one of my colleagues who's like a world expert on formal verification. And I tapped on that person's shoulder and I said, I asked a question specifically about something. And my colleague looked at me and said, I don't know. So that person had lost every single person in the room, including the experts. So you don't want to go over this hump. Where's that hump? Well, that, really depends on your audience. It depends on your material. And, a seasoned presenter will know where that hump is, hopefully. But as a new presenter, I will say that erring in this direction towards less information is much less damaging than erring in this direction too much. Because if you have too much in your talk, then you can lose some or all of your audience. If you have too little in your talk, well, you still have imparted knowledge on your audience. But if it's too little, they'll be bored. But this zone, there's a lot of zone right here that's pretty useful. So, target this zone and always tend to push yourself to less material. I've never had an opportunity to be disappointed by having less material in the presentation, including this one. Okay, number 2, you want to polish and practice to make your work likable. And this is about prejudice, right? When we think of prejudice, we often think of prejudice as a bad thing. But when you study prejudice in psychology, you can actually use prejudice in a positive or negative way. Negative prejudice, I don't like these people because of this thing, right? Positive prejudice is where you give a lot of positive feedback and you make something look great to try and give people the impression that it is great. And that's what you can do with your presentations. If you polish your presentations and your writing and you practice your talk to do a good talk, you make everything about it seem better than perhaps it even is. You start to play on people's prejudices. this thing is so polished. This must be amazing work. So it's really important to do a good job of polishing and practicing. This is also important for writing papers as well. And this becomes so evident to students when they see the acceptance rates of their first submissions versus their second submissions of their paper. Because between the first submission and the second submission, you got all kinds of time to polish your paper. Maybe your first submission, you finished, minus 10 minutes before the deadline. Like you could have used 10 more minutes to finish that paper. But on the second submission, you've polished, you've gotten more feedback, you've really worked to make that paper better. So it's really important to do your best. Now, you're not going to have a perfect presentation, but you can have a great presentation. And then finally, respect and engage your audience. Always look at your audience. Try to be aware of, are they with you? Are they seeing you? Are you providing them good information? Are you entertaining them? Very, very important. And respect them by looking directly at them. That's my recommendation. Okay, normally when I give this talk, at this point I would say, ask me anything. This is just a video recording, so I will say, comment down below. Ask me anything. I'm happy to answer any comments or email me directly. I want to say thank you for watching this talk. If you like this video, please subscribe to my YouTube. Like this video. I'd appreciate that. And best of luck to you on your research journey. If you're having challenges, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll help you in whatever way I can. And when you find success, reach out to me as well. I'd love to hear about that as well. Take care and best of luck.